I want to talk about everything that you need to know about the Dead Space remake before you spend your $70 on it if you're buying it on Xbox or PS5, or your $60 if you do end up buying it on PC. So let's get started with the overview of the game coming from Motive Studio. Motive, of course, has been a studio that EA hasn't trusted a lot into. They worked on Star Wars Squadrons, now they're back working on the Dead Space remake. Rumblings have it that they're working on a big Marvel title as well. But right now, all eyes are on the Dead Space remake. The sci-fi survival horror classic returns completely rebuilt to offer an even more immersive experience, including visual, audio, and gameplay improvements while staying faithful to the original game's thrilling vision. Now yes, this is a full-on remake, and the goal of the game was to stay faithful and true to the original of the game, honor it as a classic, but there are some refinements that hopefully will ultimately make the game better. It's been a bit expanded upon, but overall you are still getting that true and true survival horror experience that you played all the way back in 2008. Of course, the game centers around Isaac Clarke, the main character, an everyman engineer on a mission to repair a vast mining ship, the USG Ishimura, only to discover something has gone horribly wrong. The ship's crew has been slaughtered, and Isaac's beloved partner Nicole is lost somewhere on board. Now alone and armed with only his engineering tools and skills, Isaac races to find Nicole as the nightmarish mystery of what happened aboard the Ishimura unravels around him. Trapped with hostile creatures called the Necromorphs, these are disfigured abominations that you're gonna have to fight, and how you fight the Necromorphs are an integral part of the gameplay, which we'll get into in a little bit. If you guys have played Dead Space in the past, it's staying true to the gameplay style of the original, but obviously modernized for a 2023 audience. Isaac is in a wretched fight for survival, not only against the terrors of these necromorphs, but also against his own crumbling sanity. Remember, he's entrapped here along with these monstrosities, his partner's gone missing, and a battle against himself and his own sanity is going to be as big of a battle as those that he's going to face while on board. This is a sci-fi horror classic. If you go back to 2008 and you pull up some of the archives of what people were saying back then when the original Dead Space dropped, this was a game that was beloved by people. Sure, it's settled in the mid-80s on Metacritic, but you talk to people that played this game way back when, or maybe they played it after it came out, whatever, the nostalgia and the memories of Dead Space really hold true as one of the better survival horror games, and one of the best survival horror games of the last 15 years. And even while I'm incredibly excited for this remake, take it from somebody that played Dead Space a few years ago, it still holds up fairly well, and this is a game from 2008. It does show its age. Any game that's over a decade old is going to show some sort of age, but man, for a game from 08, it does hold up relatively well. But then you look at this remake, this is a ground-up remake designed for next-gen technology. A sci-fi horror classic returns fully rebuilt from the ground up with elevated visual fidelity and 3D atmospheric audio, and that audio element is imperative. Not only do you have a fully voiced Isaac Clarke now, but the audio design is something that Motive went really in-depth on, and making sure that these crackling noises, the gun sounds, and the horrors that you're going to encounter, they sound really good. And when you talk about a horror game, establishing that atmosphere is so important. You want an engrossing world that really adds to the tension of the game, and tension is what Dead Space did really well back in 08, and it looks like Motive has only built upon that, putting a lot of attention to detail in the audio as well. Whenever I talk about horror games especially, I talk about how atmosphere, and this is something that Motive particularly has very, very specific in detailing in their blog post when talking about the development of this game, that they went for creating this engrossing atmosphere and wanted to build this tension in a game. That's important in a horror game, and it seems to have resonated really true in the Dead Space remake, building upon what the original did so well all the way back in 2008. They know from the frighteningly detailed rooms and workspaces of a slaughtered crew to the eerie atmospheric sounds of a desolate spaceship, you'll explore a stunning sci-fi setting full of unpredictable and tense moments without interruption. Now, to give you an idea of how important audio is to a game like the Dead Space remake, the developers Motive went in a deep dive in a lengthy live stream talking about the Alive system within the game and how much emphasis they put into things like audio occlusion, sound effects, atmosphere, gun sounds, environmental sounds, and so on and so forth. And that's one of the first things that they looked at when talking about the Dead Space remake. So as far as sound direction goes, it seems like they've absolutely nailed that. And elements like this only complement the gameplay, which Dead Space remake already had a very sound and satisfying style of gameplay. When you battle these necromorphs, it's all about slicing them in the right portion of their body part, dismembering them, and then when you actually see the brutal kills, the brutality in Dead Space, is something that can't be understated, and another one of those immersive elements of the game that really showcase the horrors of the game, and then you can really dissect how visceral everything looks. And all of that comes together. To the visceral elements, the sound direction, the immersion, all of that is done to create a very engrossing atmosphere. And it was noted on the Dead Space blog post when talking about the remake, what makes something scary? It can be the unknown or a known threat, pure uncertainty, or the certainty of inevitable disaster. For Dead Space, it's all of those things and more linked together by one crucial element, atmosphere. When the original game came out, its atmosphere earned nearly universal praise. So when Motive set out to remake this iconic survival horror game, the designers knew they needed to nail this key element. Arguably, atmosphere is the most important ingredient for a horror game. The environment, the tension, keeping the player on the edge of their seat. All these things combine to create the atmosphere needed for a successful horror game. So how do you improve on a game that was already legendary for its pitch-perfect atmosphere? There are actually a lot of enhancements within the Dead Space remake. In terms of visuals, audio, lighting, everything is more dynamic. By having more depth here, we're able to have more control over the player's feelings of stress and excitement. For example, we have a strong element of light and shadow in the game, so the player feels like they're moving from one limited lit up area to the next, and that the shadowed areas in between are dangerous. But since the ship is in a state of disrepair, the lighting is rarely ever in a fully functional state, so you often get the sense of that the lights are about to go completely out at any given moment, and they absolutely can. The intensity director is a way for us to control the stress level for the player, but to be sure that there's always something happening. It lets us control the emotion and tension, and to always keep the player on their toes, to keep them careful. It's a content organization, spawning, and pacing control system, and depending on how we count things, the system has more than 1,200 unique events with a massive variety of combinations possible. Different elements like audio or lighting changes, fog or steam, enemy spawns, all that combined together in layers to create encounters that feel like handmade situations. That was the original intent, to make it feel like a movie even though it's fully interactive. So we monitor the amount of intensity the player is going through while going from room to room. There might be an easier room with just a few sounds here and there, but that's it. But then you might go into another room and suddenly there's a slasher spawning from a wall vent, plus the lights turn off, plus there's fog in the environment, and it becomes a lot more intense. But then we give the player a break because we do essentially track the peaks and valleys of tension to make sure that it's not just back-to-back high-intensity events. Again, with a horror game, it's about going on these peaks and valleys. You can't just constantly keep it at one pace. It's about monitoring that tension level, and having it paced correctly is always going to keep the player engaged, and looks like Motive has really implemented that in a big way when it came to the Dead Space remake. Not to say the original Dead Space didn't do that, because the original Dead Space was a really good starting point to build off of, but that looks like exactly what they did. They continued to build off of that and make it an even more compelling and engrossing experience. And it was noted just having back-to-back high-intensity events wouldn't work. That would be emotionally exhausting. You'd be like, I can't take this anymore. But it's always about putting the player in a place where they don't know exactly what to expect. And again, that's always been an issue with horror games. When you do have these back-to-back high-intensity events, you kind of get a little bit numb to it. When you're fluctuating the pacing and not making it too consistent with what you're seeing, it keeps it more of an engaging game from an atmosphere standpoint. Now, to circle back from a gameplay standpoint, it still holds up true to the original. You're going to be battling these necromorphs, and you're going to have to figure out how to strategically encounter them and take them out. It might be taking a part of their limbs off, then bashing their head in, and everything in between. You're also going to have a variety of different special abilities, stasis and kinesis. That's going to help you throughout the game as well. The game fundamentally, from a gameplay standpoint, worked in 2008, and once again, I feel like it's going to work in 2023. Now, while this is a ground-up remake, there are some things that have been changed. As I mentioned at the top, this is a fully voiced Isaac Clarke. Isaac Clarke in the original game was actually a silent protagonist. Dead Space 2 did give Isaac voice, but now with the Dead Space remake, you have Dead Space 2's voice actor, Gunnar Wright. He is returning to voice Isaac Clarke in this title as well, and now he'll interact with a variety of different ways with the characters. And yes, from a narrative standpoint, it's going to stay true to the original, but we got a little bit more of an insight on what to expect from the game from a story standpoint. That is going to expand the game a little bit while honoring the original. A great game also needs a strong thread to tie those moment-to-moment experiences together, something to draw the player forward and motivate them to uncover the next mystery, as noted on the official blog post that just dropped today as of the recording of this video. A great game, in other words, needs a great story. Fortunately, in remaking Dead Space, the team at Motive had the benefit of working from a story story that was already pretty great, one based in recognizable and near universal themes. You're descending into hell to save your beloved. That's one of the oldest stories there is, but the Dead Space interpretation of that is also very relevant because it talks about the corporate corruption, about spirituality going awry, about division versus reconnection, and it plays on the fear that we all share, the fear of the unknown, of isolation, of paranoia, dehumanization. These fears are common in all cultures, communities, and generations. They're ingrained in us at a genetic level, but it's also a real personal story. Despite the monsters and the sci-fi nature of it, you're still very anchored in something that's a personal journey and that keeps it relatable throughout. All the departments approached it with the same philosophy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. For the most part, it was about leaving alone the beats that made the game so great and improving upon the ones that were problematic, where we thought we could do better. Walking that line was often difficult, but I think we struck a really good balance. As a result, many of the changes were done primarily for the sake of consistency and continuity. There have been a lot of stories told inside the Dead Space universe coming from creative director Roman Campos Oriola. With the later games, the books, the comics, and the movie, so what we tried to do in this game is add a little bit more lore or make some adjustments to the lore to have better continuity with the broader universe. Other changes involve fleshing out what was already there. We also gave a bit more screen time and agency and overall personality to some of the second characters. Some were really important ones like Nicole and Mercer, but even characters like Jacob and Elizabeth, who were only really in audio logs in the original game, now actually have some screen time and they have a role to play. Right, it was important to give them more background, depth, and motivation so the personal connections feel more meaningful. So there are some very compelling threads the players can follow through these new side quests, and the side quests also allow us to look at the ship's descent into chaos a little bit more, kind of going backward and investigating that, so the bones of the story are very close. So from a narrative standpoint, expect something that holds true to the original while also expanding upon it. I think this is what everybody really wants out of a remake, while honoring the original game, and the original game having a narrative thread that people were incredibly engaged by. Now you do have a fully voiced Isaac Clarke, so that's going to add a new layer to the game, and on top of that, you have fleshed out some of the threads and some of the stories and characters that are present in the game, but that's not going to be deterring you overall from the main narrative that is in the game, only making it better. At least that's the goal of what Motive was trying to do. And it's always going to be a fine line you have to walk whenever you're adapting something into a new medium or you're creating a remake, in terms of honoring the original, making the narrative threads make sense, but also now adding a bit of continuity and now making the overall package feel more compelling. And it looks like that's exactly what they're going for and what they're going to deliver on when the game actually does release. Speaking of when the game releases, let's wrap up this video by taking a look at some of the elements as far as buying the game, when the game is going to be out, and everything like that. As I mentioned on the top, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series, PC releases. It will be $69.99, a $70 price tag on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series. If you're buying the game on Steam, Epic Game Store, or Origin, probably on Steam. If you are buying it on PC, it will be $59.99. Not only that, if you do buy it on PC and through Steam, you will get a free copy of Dead Space 2. How you want to value that, given that that is a game from, I believe, 2011, that will be up for you to decide, but Dead Space 2 was a fantastic game as well, so if you want to follow up playing the remake with Dead Space 2, that is an option. Dead Space 2, if you buy it on PC, that will be added to your library come the day of the game's release. System requirements are a Ryzen 5 5600X for recommended, i5-11600K, RX 6700 XT, and an RTX 2070 for the GPU, recommended of 16GB of RAM. Not only that, there will be a digital deluxe edition that will be priced at $10 more, $69.99 on PC, while $79.99 on consoles. Now, this isn't something that is going to be a mandatory buy. It'll include 3 unique suits and 2 suit textures, so nothing too major as far as additions from buying the base game and the digital deluxe. But if you do want to check it out and spend an extra $10, that is your prerogative, and you could do so. The game will officially be released on January the 27th, so that is gonna do it for me. This is all the information that I wanted to go over. I really wanted to highlight the atmosphere elements because this is something from the get-go. From an audio standpoint, lighting, world design, it seemed like they really wanted to emphasize that, and as far